The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an economics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by eKonomics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Listeners, welcome back to The Dirt. I'm glad you're tuning in today. We've got another continuation of our series from the Western Prairies of Canada. We've got Ray Dowbenko in the studio with us today, and we're going to talk about the importance of sulfur in crop production. Now, we've done several episodes in the past talking about sulfur, but I wanted to get Ray on and talk about this primarily because Ray is going to give us a different perspective. He's been in that Western Canadian area for a long time. He knows about the need for sulfur, and especially with canola, a crop that really needs that sulfur to complete its life cycle. Ray, welcome to The Dirt.
Hey, Mike, thanks again for asking.
Ray, we really wish you would take just a moment and tell them who you are and what you did for most of your career.
Sure thing, and thanks, Mike. So I did my graduate work at University of Manitoba, and I finished that up in 1989 and went straight into the fertilizer industry. One of the companies was one of the predecessor companies of what is now Nutrien. So I've lived and worked in Saskatchewan and different parts of Alberta. I'm currently based in Calgary, Alberta. I've had a pretty much a 30-year-long career with Nutrien. I started out doing field research, being a research and extension agronomist, new product development, market support, working with crop nutrition and soil fertility, soil chemistry issues. So mostly educating, learning, and then sharing the information that I accumulated with growers and retailers and hoping to help them move ahead in their farm operations.
Okay, Ray, well, let's dive right in and talk about the importance of sulfur. You know, we've had several episodes of The Dirt where we talked about sulfur and why we need it for crop production. Let's take just a minute, if you will, and remind our listeners why sulfur is so important in crop production.
Sure, and I'm sure from previous podcasts, your guests have talked about, the importance of sulfur in amino acid production. So things like cysteine and methionine require sulfur, and that's involved in protein synthesis. So we're looking to make more efficient use of the nitrogen for protein. So if you don't have adequate sulfur, you're not going to have adequate nitrogen use efficiency and inadequate protein production. So it's involved in photosynthesis, as I mentioned, nitrogen use efficiency, nodule formation for legume crops that fix their own nitrogen, so important for things like soybeans and peas, lentils, that type of thing. It's also important in pod fill and grain fill. So it plays a number of different roles, and it has many different interactions with other nutrients in the crop. And one of the things that, really came apparent to me early in my career, especially here in Alberta, when we were growing canola, and people were putting a lot of nitrogen on, and the canola was not growing very well. It was actually going backwards with high nitrogen rates, and it was back in the 80s, 1983, 1985, that the light bulb went off for most people in Western Canada, is we didn't have enough sulfur. And it's completely different when you travel into parts of the United States, and where I've traveled in northeastern United States, southeastern. Sulfur wasn't so much of an issue 30 years ago, but it certainly is today. And, it speaks to environmental issues and the cleanup of sulfur in the atmosphere, atmospheric deposition. But we never really had that issue in Canada. So to your comment, Mike, yeah, we've had a lot more experience with sulfur management in the Canadian prairies than in most parts of North America.
You know, that's exactly right, Ray. We cleaned up this emissions and we were getting free sulfur up until then. And there was so much sulfur deposited in some areas that they're still reaping the benefits of that today. I'm hearing some of those last holdout areas are really getting depleted now, and they're going to have to start making some sulfur applications in the near future. But we didn't have a lot of sulfur nutrition work going on here in the U.S. until probably the last 10 or 12 years. I think there in Canada, y'all have been doing research a lot longer than that. Talk a little bit about why sulfur is needed more in canola than some of the other crops. It seems like everybody is worried about sulfur in canola.
Yeah, typically that's very true. I mean, it's not to disparage or dismiss other crops, because all the crops, as I said, have a need for sulfur, and generally most crops require as much sulfur as they do phosphorus. But for canola has a very high protein content and a high percentage of oil. And that means a high percentage of amino acids. And again, that means cysteine and methionine, and they need sulfur to form those two amino acids. And typically a bushel of canola is going to take about half a pound of sulfur for every bushel. And so we need to recognize, if we're growing anywhere between 35 and 70 bushel canola in some areas, depending upon what area of the prairies we're talking about. We have very significant sulfur demands. And it's not all necessarily going to come from fertilizer application. We get mineralization from soil organic matter. We get leftover sulfur from past applications. But we're generally looking at least 35 pounds of sulfur going on per acre. And after that, it's tough to say from research that, is more than 35 pounds of actual sulfur needed in a growing season or not. And it's kind of a diminishing return type of thing. Usually, with regular nitrogen applications, 30 to 35 pounds of sulfur is the upper limit of what we seem to need.
Well, Ray, we always want to keep the 4 R's in mind when we're talking about fertilizer recommendations. You just mentioned rates, but today I wanted to focus on two of the other R's. I wanted to really spend a little time talking about the time and the source of this sulfur nutrition. As far as timing goes, when do plants need the sulfur to be the most available?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. And I'm actually going to not hijack just yet, but I will because I want to talk about time in two respects. Time, as you said, in the crop, and then time with respect to the source of nitrogen. But with respect to the crop, most crops have a season long requirement for sulfur. Again, much like phosphorus, they'll start taking it up early and take it out through season long. If I look at something like canola, probably if we had to address sulfur deficiency in canola, we can go up to the early flower stage. Unlike nitrogen, which we should get on prior to bolting, sulfur, we've got a little bit more time. We can go up to the flower stage, but we do want to have that sulfur in the soil and available for the growing season. One reason for that is that sulfur is not mobile in the crop. So as the crop is growing, it needs a continuous supply of sulfur. It can't be translocated from lower leaves to new growth. So we're going to need season-long available sulfur for that. And then that speaks to, the time of application and the source, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I wanted to go next, Ray. When we think about sulfur sources, there's really two buckets. We've got the elemental sulfur, or then we've got the sulfate sulfur. Talk a little bit about the differences in those two and when we should use one versus the other.
Yeah, well, things like ammonium sulfate, so that might be 20.50024 or 210024, the first number being percent nitrogen, the last number being percent sulfur, is an ammonium sulfate. And typically we think about that as being immediately plant available when it gets put in the soil. So it's immediately plant available, and that's great for the plant. But sulfur is also mobile in the soil, which, depending upon your environment, may not be so great because it's predisposed to leaching if you have heavy rainfall or water moving through the soil profile. So, if you're in a drier area where you don't have a lot of potential for leaching, ammonium sulfate is typically used. We do have some areas that have significant moisture where we may be looking, as you say, at elemental sulfur product, depending upon the application method and the time that may be applied the previous fall, get some chance to break apart the granules to get some oxidation of the elemental sulfur to the sulfate form so that we have some sulfate available in the spring at the start of the season, and the balance of that oxidation is happening during the growing season. And then it depends on the type of product, and we have different types of products out there. Certainly there's pure elemental, and then there's what I will refer to as sort of hybrids, like the MAP MST, that has a portion of elemental and a portion of sulfate, sort of get the crop started with an available source and have that oxidation going on through the season from the elemental. And there's, pros and cons for all of this. And, the pros for the sulfate is immediately available. The con is that it's also a potentially leachable source. The benefit of the elemental is that it's a protected source, but the negative may be that you're not getting the oxidation when you need it for crop availability. So it's a balancing act.
Well, Ray, I've heard for a long time that we really wanted to stay away from elemental sulfur just because it's not going to be all available in that first year. And that's going to be another it depends situation. We're looking at your part of the world, it may take it 2 or 3 years before all of that sulfur is available for the plant. If we look in a situation like that I'm in, it may be available within the first year just because of the heat difference there. Talk a little bit about what has to happen for that elemental sulfur to be oxidized and be available for the plant to take it up.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the geographical separation that you just mentioned. Here in Western Canada, back in the 80s, we have gas plants, oil plants producing brick sulfur, people chopping it up into chunks and making elemental sulfur and putting it on as a fertilizer and putting it on in the spring and it's not working. And people say, well, you can't use elemental. Well, it wasn't that the product was necessarily no good. It was a time of application, you needed that oxidation. So applying it for us in the fall, having some dissolution of the granule, some fracturing, exposing more of the surface area to microbial breakdown and that oxidation that you mentioned is what we need. If I'm in Mississippi, Louisiana, theoretically, there's probably cases where I could put out my elemental sulfur in the spring and have available sulfur for the growing season. Because you do have that humidity, you have that microbial community, the activity is so much better. The other thing that we look at with elemental sulfur, not just the time, giving it oxidation, is we can build up, and we've seen this in research, build up oxidizing bacteria communities in the soil by repeated applications of elemental sulfur. We start to feed microbial communities and we see a buildup over time with repeated elemental sulfur applications. And then some work Mike McLaughlin did in Australia looking at multiple applications of elemental sulfur and seeing this community buildup of microbial oxidizers of elemental, but also a staircase like effect where you have year one's oxidation occurring and producing some oxidized elemental sulfur to sulfate. And then you have year two application on top of that, and year three and year four, and you get a continued cycle, if you will, of continuously releasing elemental sulfur and a continuous source of ammonium sulfate sulfur or sulfate sulfur in that application situation.
And Ray, you kind of mentioned it a few minutes ago. You talked about some of these new forms of sulfur that is a combination of elemental sulfur, the micronized sulfur, as well as the sulfate sulfur. Talk a little bit about how these products work and how they're different than either the sulfate sulfur or the elemental sulfur.
Yeah, the combination products or the pure elemental, I referenced the chunk, which maybe was unfair, but that's what it really was like 30 or 40 years ago. People didn't recognize that we needed a certain micron size, a certain small size to start to break down fracture. And as I said earlier, expose multiple surface areas for oxidation by the microbial community. If we have very large particle sizes, it's a very small surface area, and we don't get very quick oxidation or breakdown of the particle. It used to be we would tell people that we want to see sub 200 or 100 micron particle size to get relatively effective breakdown of the granule, that elemental sulfur particle, and exposure of large surface area for the microbial community. We're seeing some of the newer products now that have sub 30 micron, 20 micron particle size, extremely small particles that break down very quickly, expose themselves to that microbial community. So that's very important in the elemental sulfur aspect, is to have small particle size for rapid breakdown, dissolution of the granule, and also exposure of surface area.
So, Ray, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like that type of product, it would also help protect against some of those leaching losses while that product is being broken down. Is that right?
I think that would be a fair comment because you're going to have relatively quick oxidation, but it's not oxidation of everything all at once. It's oxidation in a progression through time, much like a controlled release nitrogen source. Not as precise as a polymer coated nitrogen like ESN in terms of release rates, but a similar idea can be applied to an elemental sulfur product, such as you mentioned.
Okay, Ray. Well, I really appreciate you going through this with us, helping us understand these different products and when and how to use them. Is there anything else we need to realize about sulfur before we sign off today?
Well, with respect to sulfur, as you started out at the top of the podcast, we look at 4R nutrition, source rate, and time. And, if you're looking at the 4R nutrition, I think the people who are listeners, retailers, growers need to understand that you don't look at 4Rs in isolation. All of the R's are interconnected. And so we brought that out in the podcast, I think, when we talked about time. Well, it depends on the product. We talk about the application method, it depends on the product, and we talk about the availability of each product, and that depends on the product. So you have to consider what product you're using for your environment, how is it best applied, and when is it best applied to get the best benefit. And I know you're going to have other podcasts with people talking about sulfur nutrition. I know you've had other researchers and university people talking about sulfur. I, again, just want to reiterate the podcast and the dirt is just a tremendous resource that Nutrien provides, and you provide, Mike, to the guests and the listeners. And I just think, again, retailers, growers, crop consultants need to access this type of resource as needed and just check out the websites and get all the benefit of the downloads that are available.
Ray, we really appreciate that. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this episode as we refreshed our memory and dived into a few new topics in the world of sulfur. And if you will, hang around for just a couple of moments and we'll be right back with segment 2. Farming isn't farming without questions, and now there's a place to go for answers. At eKonomics, an entire team of agronomists is waiting and ready to help for free. No question is too big or too small. Visit Nutrien-eKonomics.com and submit your question with the Ask an Agronomist feature. Listeners, welcome back for segment 2. As you know, now's the time where we ask one of our agronomists our question of the week. And today we have Dr. Carl Wyant, Director of Agronomy with Nutrien, back in the studio with us. Carl, welcome back.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Carl, today we wanted to talk a little bit about magnesium and the role it plays in crop production. Also, we wanted to know if there's any relationship between magnesium and nitrogen. Can you help us out with this?
Sure thing. Let's just go back to what makes plants so unique, and that is they can take that sunlight, all that energy that's hitting the earth every single day, they can grab that sunlight and they can transform it into a form of energy that's actually usable by the plant. It's a very unique set of reactions. We can't do that. Go lay in your driveway, you're just going to get a sunburn. But, your plant or your crop can actually do something with all that sunlight and start making energy. The thing that makes the energy, like the translation sort of mechanism, is chlorophyll. And if you were to break down that structure of chlorophyll, you would find magnesium sitting right in the center of that green pigment. So magnesium helps to translate sun energy into plant available energy. And so if you see plants without enough magnesium, they start to turn yellow on you, stunted growth. They can't use the energy from the sun like you want them to. So big reason to have magnesium in a program or to be looking for any challenges with magnesium supply. There's some other examples of why we need magnesium. Serves as the building blocks when we're trying to build protein. They help build the workbench, the ribosome, to make that protein. They also help to make that in the cellular machinery. They start to make that ATP, or the currency that's used to pay for biological work. So lots of reasons to get excited about magnesium. One thing we also get excited about in the agronomy world is interactions. Now we're not talking about antagonisms. What we're talking about is these synergisms. So we see that between magnesium and nitrogen. When we have a good magnesium program, it typically adds more efficiency to your nitrogen program. Your plant is healthy, your plant is well fed with the nutrients it needs, and it can take in more nitrogen as a result, and you get more on your fertilizer program.
Carl, that's something we definitely need to check out. Anything we can do to help with our nitrogen use efficiency, that's going to be money back in the grower's pocket. So we need to pay special attention to this.
That's right.
Carl, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time out to enlighten us a little bit more about magnesium and the role it plays in crop production. Listeners, thanks for tuning in this week. And as always, if you need any more information on anything we've talked about today, you can visit our website. That's Nutrien-eKonomics.com. Until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt. Hey guys, if you like what you heard today, do us a favor and share this podcast with someone else. It could be your neighbor, your friend, your crop advisor, or whoever you think would enjoy it. Your support helps ensure future episodes, so please like, subscribe, share, and rate the show wherever you're listening from.